Next guest, he comes from Israel and he's been working with men for quite some time. And I have to say shalom, correct? Which, if I understand in the Hebrew language, means peace be with you, correct?
Very much so. Correct, and shalom to all of you.
Tell us what you do in Israel, because what you're doing is pretty amazing. You've got a national men's health line, the only one of its kind in Israel, and you're helping men, particularly those going through the trials associated with the whole family law systems, which seem to actually, unfortunately, it's been a Western disease which is now exported right around the world. We heard from India, we're hearing from Nigeria. What's it like in Israel, Benny?
Well, it's more or less the same. It's a tough issue to get people to acknowledge and persuade. It's a kind of a counterintuitive story, I think, when men have it tough and when men are in distress and need support, and either of the systems or just the general public. And I've started working with men who are abusive and violent towards their spouse almost 30 years ago, and I've done that for 10 years. But I constantly heard from them when I was doing anger management groups as a clinical social worker. I was constantly hearing that, Benny, it's okay that the judge has sent me here, but why isn't my wife in the next room? I mean, she was also, before I pushed her, she threw her cell phone at me, and she just needs anger management as I do. Why is my wife never called in? And I thought that's a kind of a concrete question. And when I was young in the career, I used to bring it to supervision, and I was told, Benny, no, tell him not to talk about his wife. Tell him to talk about himself. It's a projection. But after I've heard that about 50, 100, 150 times, I started digging more into it. And my PhD was my first academic research in Israel about women's abuse and violence towards a male partner. And then that was 10 years ago, I founded together with other women social workers, By Your Side, which is the organization that you're talking about, where we help men who find themselves under parental disputes, parental alienation, the bias of the welfare and the court system. And so it's been already over 10 years that we've been doing this work in Israel. And I'm in my position, both as a psychotherapist and an academic researcher. I know the situation, and we're trying also to influence policy, but it's very difficult. It's always an uphill climb.
Yeah, no, look, Benny, it sounds like you're doing some great work there.
I'll just say about the organization, we're basically serving like 3,000 men a year.
Wow.
And we live off a few funders, but mainly men who pay for their services. It's also tough because the men who approach us are usually quite limited in their resources. We're fighting like hell for government resources and funding, not much success.
Yeah.
And in Israel, women's organizations that historically have been very strong, and we've just lately asked from the Parliament and the government to give a kind of a transparent report of how much money goes to women's organization and how much goes to men's organization. I think it's a tough question for them to answer, and I won't be surprised if it's single digits, whatever goes to men's organization. So, like I said before, for the time being, we're over 10 years in our activity, and we find it very tough. And we are seen as a kind of what you call it, like a red sheet in the eyes of the policy makers, and we're usually treated with a lot of suspicion. And just as the same as my book, I mean, I've written my book called The Other Side of the Pain: Men Living with an Abusive Female Partner. It came out in Hebrew this year, and hopefully I'll have it done and translated to English by early summer. And first chapter was just 10 examples of men I've seen in my clinic, because most people, unless they know, like people like we do, unless they've came across a situation of a man in such a predicament and position, usually they would ask me, no, I don't get it. She hits him. What's the story? And they would start laughing and make funny out of it. And so I've just basically started with 10 examples of what was it like, even when there's no physical violence, just emotional abuse that could, tear somebody's life apart, let alone false allegations or things like that that could bury a decent father for 4 or 5 years until he comes out of it. So that's my book. And that my book is very critical because also a chapter about policemen, judges, and social workers that are the main systems who deal with men and fathers. And they're very biased, and it's known in the research, it's known empirically that men in the welfare systems are secondary clients. Basically, the whole system is usually positioned and in the mindset of women. And when men come up with issues, they usually don't know how to handle it. And the truth is that few therapists even know how to talk to men because it's a different type of talk than talking to a woman, which is because psychology is supposedly a more feminine kind of sphere. Men need help. Men feel no less than women, but very few therapists, unfortunately, know how to talk to men because it's also a certain type of skill.
Yeah. I think we had an earlier guest, Rob from Better Blokes or Blokes Advice, and they say men don't like to feel talked down to. I think often in a health setting, men maybe feel like they're being lectured to, whereas men they want solutions to their problems, but not necessarily to be judged. I mean, no one wants to be judged, really. Let's just be honest. But I think the way that health services sometimes let men down. Would you say that's the experience there in Israel?
Let down is the is the end situation, but even in the entrance, I think that the mindset of most of the systems is unempathic, and again, because it's a counterintuitive phenomena in a way, and unless people know such an incident from my brother, my father, a friend of mine, and then people who know such situations tell me immediately, Benny, we know exactly what your book is about. Good, you've written such a book. But most people are kind of suspicious. And with the welfare system, again, like social work, for instance, which is the main profession dealing with men in custody disputes or in allegations of violence, physical violence, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. There is an emotional bias because it's a women's sphere and territory. Most social workers are women social workers. And there's a lot of intuition and feminist ideology, like radical feminist ideology in the pool. And although the empirical research since the mid-70s in national surveys in the United States have shown that the prevalence of offending an intimate partner are not that different between men and women, depends on the survey and the questions and the questionnaire, etc. It's very difficult for professionals to cling and to hook up and to accept the empirical research and to change their mindset. So obviously men many times are disappointed or feel pushed away or feel unempathic. And again, I've just lately I've came across a father who's not a good enough father. He's a very good father. And he wrote a booklet about 5 meetings he had with a social worker here in Israel. And he says that in the third out of 5 meetings, he started telling her about the serious emotional abuse that he's been exposed to in his marriage. The social worker didn't ask him one question, one clarifying question, didn't mention it in the report to the court. And we can all imagine that if you change the gender of this story, a woman coming to a social worker telling her about a serious emotional abuse from a father and it not getting one question, let alone being mentioned in a report to the court, is basically it's professional malpractice.
Yeah.
What's happening with men and fathers. So to your question, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Benny, just getting back to this stats, I've done I'm happily married. My wife's put up with me for 50 years. She should get a gold medal. So I've got no axe to grind here, Benny, but I've looked at the stats and I've been looking at them for, this is 20 years now. And the actual empirical evidence, as you have pointed out, is that the horrible reality is that violence between men and women is actually very, very equal. And unfortunately, sometimes women start it, the man finishes it, whatever happens. But the bottom line is that there's often two sides to it. You've got to also allow that there's oftentimes there's drugs and alcohol involved in these situations. There's also situations where there's porn involved, etc., etc. So you've got these other situations that are, if you like, inflaming these aggravations and these situations. And in my own life, you talk about your own personal experience. So I grew up in a broken home. Great mum, great dad. They just couldn't get on, but I've never saw my dad. They're both passed on now. They're in a better place, thank God. And I love them dearly. I love my mum. I love my dad. But I've never saw my dad hit my mother. Never, ever, ever, never. And they had some loud exchanges. Had the police come down. But I have seen my mother draw blood on my father. And so I know that domestic violence happens to men because I saw it happen to my dad. And so when men ring me up and say, look, Nathaniel talks about taking the calls. Nathaniel's running Dads4Kids these days, and I'm not taking as many of those calls. But like him, many times I've just wept with men as they tell me the story. No one listens to them. No one hears them. They're almost invisible to the court system. They're certainly invisible in the judiciary and the criminal world. And they're treated as if they're guilty. There's not innocent till proven guilty. You're guilty, and then you have to fight to prove your innocence, which is a very big handicap. And that only seems to occur to men. In my mind, I mean, obviously there's swings and roundabouts, and I have heard of a woman who killed herself in the middle of a terrible divorce. So, I mean, bad things happen. Bad things happen when people break up, and everyone suffers. The children suffer the most. But certainly what we've got to do is we've got to introduce some sort of equity, some sort of fairness, and treat men and women the same. Let's encourage them to work it out. Let's encourage them rather than pit themselves against each other. Let's work towards to support them. Your comment?
I agree. I would like to say one thing about the surveys and the empirical research. Many people ask me, especially when I'm lecturing about my book, if my basic argument is that men's violence and women's violence is the same phenomena or identical phenomena. And the answer is no. For the reason that aggressive behavior is a spectrum from passive aggressive to murdering somebody. And at the very harsh end of the spectrum, men are known to be more murderous, more frightening, and more physically injurious. But, and it's a big and important but, most parental disputes are not at the harsh end of the spectrum. They're usually emotional and verbal, and if there's any physical violence, it's usually moderate of pushing and shoving, and not anything threatening and alarming. And this is where the most of the characteristics of men's and women's violence are pretty similar in the predictors of what will make a child behave in an aggressive or become a victim in a romantic relationship in adulthood, the motivations, the personality disorders that predict it. So there's much more similarities than differences, but it's not an identical issue. And there's also obviously more macro social issues with women. For instance, in the Jewish Orthodox community or the Arab community in Israel, it's tougher for a woman to come out of an abusive relationship than it is for a secular woman in Tel Aviv, for instance. So culture can make barriers harder and tougher for women still, but in the home and behind closed doors, it's usually much of it is pretty similar, and we should treat a man who report living in an abusive or in high intensity relationships with seriousness, with respect, and there's much more room for being way more assertive with women who are abusive, both in courts and in welfare systems, because it's basically when we're ignoring this phenomena of women's abuse and violence, we're not helping the healing of a family, and we're definitely keeping the harm where children and as you said, suffer a great deal emotionally, cognitively, socially. It's all seriously proven. So there must be a change of mindset and acknowledging, and that's the work that you do, we do, and so many men and women who are activists in this regard in so many countries. And thank you for holding this day, and thank you for having me today.
Well, Benny, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. We honour your work in Israel, and shalom.
Yeah, thank you.
Kol tov, all the best. Take care, guys.
Thank you.